Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. The Iowa Class Battleships were the largest and best battleships ever built by the United States, arguably the best battleships ever built in the world. By the 1980s, there was nothing else in the world that could seriously threaten them. However, the Navy didn't like everything about the Iowa Class videos. This video, we're going to talk about some of the things that they didn't like, and we're going to use plans they had for future battleship construction, plans they had for modifying the Iowas that existed, and plans they had for modifying Iowas that were still under construction at the end of World War II. We have to remember, in the 1980s, there were no other battleships in the world. These were the best there were. But in the 1940s, when these ships were built and originally operated, they were seeing hard combat, and there were a number of enemy battleships out there. And if you've been watching our ship comparison videos that we tend to release on Mondays, you'll see that while the Iowas compare very favorably to a lot of these battleships that were built or under design during World War II, they often are bested in individual areas. While they may be the fastest, they're certainly not the best armored. While the Navy loved their guns and their sheer size for the reserve of buoyancy that allowed them to keep adding more and more stuff onto them, there were other things that the Navy didn't like. So, first off, let's talk about the bridge. Iowa and New Jersey were originally built with an open bridge like earlier battleships. Pretty early on, New Jersey's was enclosed with a rounded bridge. The Navy didn't like that much either. When Wisconsin and Missouri were completed, and when Iowa and New Jersey went into the Puget Sound Navy Yard in 1945, their bridge was replaced with the squarish bridge you see behind me. Inside of that bridge is an armored conning tower. It's the single thickest piece of armor on the ship, 17.3 inches thick. It's a lot of weight, very high up in the superstructure, which affects the center of buoyancy because that weight is so high. And it's not all that functional. It's a fairly small armored tube, and if it takes a hit, it'll stop the shell from coming through, but the concussion might not stop that from turning the bridge crew and the officers inside into jelly. When the Pearl Harbor battleships, California, Tennessee, and West Virginia, were refit with modern superstructures, they had their conning towers deleted. And instead of being Class A armor plate, it was replaced with 4 or 5 inches of special treatment steel. The debate for the succeeding Montana-class battleships, which would have come after the Iowas, went back and forth on whether they have a conning tower or just a small, splinter-protected booth. To save weight, Illinois and Kentucky probably would not have had their conning tower, and if the United States had continued to build battleships after that, those would have also had the conning tower deleted. Other battleships around the world had already made this transition. The Royal Navy in particular, which was the first to adopt a modern Citadel-style superstructure, had already deleted the armored conning tower. And this did not affect negatively their battleships in combat during World War II. Although Prince of Wales, in her fight with Bismarck, had her bridge hit and a number of the bridge crew were killed, the ship was still conned from the bridge for the duration of the battle. Another thing the Navy didn't like about the superstructure was how much of the ship it took up lengthwise. This limited the arcs of fire for the anti-aircraft guns, and in the extreme late war era, 1945-ish, there's a rumor that Admiral King and Admiral Nimitz met and wrote down on the back of a napkin at a restaurant a new design for the Iowa Class battleships, which would have included trunking the 2 funnels into a single funnel, moving the superstructure back slightly. This would have improved the AA arcs of fire, and it would have been in line with updates that were made to Baltimore and Cleveland class cruisers, with their successing heavy and light cruisers built after the war, having all of the superstructure condensed and trunked together. So if you look at ships like the Fargo class, which succeeded the Cleveland, or the Oregon City and Des Moines classes, which succeeded the Baltimores, you see that this trunked superstructure. Another thing that the Navy was constantly updating and changing about the Iowas was their mast configurations. They were built with a pole foremast coming out of the forward superstructure and a single pole mainmast coming out of the second funnel. On top of these, a progressive number of radars and progressively larger radars were added. So throughout the ship's career, you see the pole masts being replaced by tripods or even duopods or quadrupodal masts that can hold bigger radar antennas. Had Illinois and Kentucky been built, future battleships afterwards, which were planned to have more electronics, they would have undoubtedly had sturdier masts. The Iowas were made extremely long and narrow to achieve their high speed of 33 knots. They were designed to be the fastest battleships ever built, and they were. However, with this high speed and this narrow bow, it meant that there wasn't much buoyancy in the bow, and it wasn't very wide. Because it's narrow and doesn't have a bunch of air in there for buoyancy, it means that the bow of the ship would have gone into the waves significantly. These ships were extremely wet forward in heavy weather and at high speeds. You see that's why they have an extreme shear on the bow where it angles up to try and shed that water. If that weight stays on the bow, it's so narrow there isn't enough buoyancy to pop it back up. So it's got to shed it aft. British battleships built around the same time had a completely flat deck forward so that they could fire their guns straight ahead. The U.S. Navy, even though older battleships were designed like that, intentionally decided this was better, this sheer forward, and retained that with the succeeding Montana class. One thing they didn't like, though, is how narrow it got there. This limits the depth of the torpedo defense, and it causes some weird wave formations as the hull gets wider around the turrets here. So the waves are coming down the long, narrow part of the ship, and then they are pushed out by the wider hull. This makes it incredibly difficult when these ships are doing unrep, whether they're taking on oil or more frequently when they're refueling the destroyers that are escorting them. The destroyers don't have the same range as the battleships. New Jersey can sail 15,000 nautical miles and can hold close to 2.5 million gallons of fuel. So these ships were frequently used to refuel the other ships around them. There were even some designs to turn later Iowa Class battleships into refueling ships. But the shape of the hull didn't really work with that, and the refueling stations here were constantly being enlarged to pump fuel faster and being moved further and further aft where the hull gets straighter and the wave formations are less dangerous to the smaller ships refueling. Another thing that the Navy was constantly updating on the Iowa Class battleships was the anti-aircraft armament. They absolutely loved the main guns, the 16-inch guns, and so much so that they were going to maintain that 16-inch 50 caliber gun in future battleship designs rather than switch over to an 18-inch gun, which had been tested. But for the smaller guns, they were constantly trying to improve them. The 5-inch 38s were easily the best dual-purpose gun of World War II, maybe of all time. However, the Navy didn't like their range, about 9 miles, and looked to replace them with a 5-inch 54 in future battleship construction, such as the Montanas. The Iowas would have probably never had them replaced. That even Illinois and Kentucky built later would have probably maintained these guns. However, the placement would have changed. The Iowas have 5 twin turrets on each side of the ship. This means you can fire 5 to each broadside and 2 forward and aft. American cruisers featured a 5-inch gun at the bow and stern ends of the superstructure, superfiring over the turrets. That meant that they had an extra barrel on each broadside, or an extra gun mount on each broadside, and an extra one fore and aft. So Illinois and Kentucky, if they had have had the superstructure condensed into a single funnel, they would have probably also had the 5-inch guns, some of them moved around. The cruisers that got this modification and the Montanas also had all their 5-inch guns dropped a story. New Jersey's 5-inch guns are on the 01 and 02 level because they sit on top of their own handling rooms. This puts weight higher in the superstructure. And since we're adding more and more electronics high in the superstructure, these immediate post-war ships had the guns dropped to main deck and 01 level and had those handling rooms moved inside the skin of the ship. This protects them better and saves you on top weight. Well, the Iowas are saving a tremendous amount of weight. If they delete the conning towers, there's a couple hundred tons right there. And while the original 4 Iowa Class Battleships were partially riveted and partially welded because this was a new technology, Illinois and Kentucky were going to be 100% welded. Welding saves approximately 10% weight. So for a ship with a steel hull that's about 40,000 tons, that's saving 4,000 tons of weight. That's about the weight of 2 of the triple 16-inch turrets. So these ships are getting a lot more reserve of buoyancy. It's unclear what the Navy would have done with that. They wouldn't necessarily have used it all for more electronics. That's weight high up in the superstructure, but it's not a tremendous amount of weight in total. They may have added it for more fuel. The Iowas have about 300 void spaces. Only about a third of that is used for fuel oil. So the ship could have easily taken more fuel and increased its range, and that gives it even more utility. Otherwise, it's kind of unclear. The Navy does increase the armor of later Iowa-class ships. Iowa and New Jersey, trying to maintain the 45,000 tons of the London Naval Treaty escalator clause, only had a little over 11 inches of armor plating on their bulkheads. On Missouri, Wisconsin, and presumably Illinois and Kentucky, which had enough time between when the treaty expired and when they were ordering the armor plates, were able to increase that by a couple of inches and several hundred tons. Possibly armor could have been strengthened elsewhere, but that's a really long lead time item, and Kentucky at least had her hull mostly completed, to the second deck at least. Now going back to the anti-aircraft guns. The 20mm gun was a great addition to the U.S. arsenal in 1942, but the single-barreled mounts didn't have enough stopping power when faster-moving, heavier armored aircraft came out, and when kamikazes entered the scene. So in the immediate post-war years, you see them deleted. During the war, you see single mounts being replaced by twin mounts. In theory, this can be done on a one-for-one basis because you're saving weight in gun crew. But in practice, the twin mount isn't quite as effective. It vibrates too much to be very accurate. And the mount itself is heavier even if you're replacing the weight of sailors. So you're seeing 3 single mounts being replaced by a twin mount. And you're not seeing all of the single mounts replaced. Also, at the extreme end of the war, the U.S. Navy came up with a 20mm weapon system called the Thunderbolt. This was designed for the PT boats to up-gun them. But some of the older battleships started getting experimental Thunderbolt mounts. These were power-trained, 4-barreled 20mm mounts, so you could replace an entire battery with a single Thunderbolt. And I think it's reasonable to assume that if World War II had continued, if the atomic bombs hadn't worked and the invasion of Japan had have happened, Operation Downfall, with the number of kamikazes that would have been attacking the fleet, I think it's reasonable to expect that modern ships being built would have had the Thunderbolt, and older ships would have been retrofitted with it. Likewise, the 40 millimeters were a great addition to the fleet, but by the end of the war lacked stopping power. There were plans to rearm the Iowa Class battleships with 3-inch guns instead of 40 millimeter guns. Now, New Jersey was originally built with 16 quad mounts, and an extra 4 were added during the war. Missouri and Wisconsin were built with those 4 from day one. The plans that were drawn up showed the 20 quad 40 mounts being replaced by 12 twin 3-inch mounts. These 3-inch mounts were automatic loaders, like were featured on Des Moines class heavy cruisers. In theory, a single quad 40 could be replaced by a twin 3-inch mount. In practice, with all the associated equipment, magazines, and the fire control, radar-guided fire control, and powertrain systems for these mounts, it was really 2 twin 3-inch mounts would replace 3 quad 40 mounts. So 12 of those mounts for 24 barrels total, but with the radar fire control and their great stopping power and their high rate of fire, they would have been able to put a similar amount of explosives in the air, and they would have been VT fused, a veritably timed fuse, unlike the quad 40s of World War II. So another thing the Navy didn't like about the Iowas was the boat hailing arrangements. Initially, like older battleships, the boats were going to be carried amidships between the funnels, and there would have been large cranes there. The original plans for the Iowas showed this. In practice, this was never completed, and the step-up structure, which had 3 quad 40 mounts, was placed between the funnels instead. This greatly increased the anti-aircraft battery. Interestingly, on New Jersey, the original boat mounting points can be seen inside of that structure, so it wasn't just something that was planned and then deleted. They actually built part of it before switching over to the 40 millimeter mount. Because of this, the ships didn't carry many boats during World War II. It's probably for the best. American cruisers off Guadalcanal with boats and aircraft stored amidships, when they were hit, they tended to burn and do a lot of damage. The boats had fuel on them, they were made out of wood, and they couldn't be easily gotten rid of. The Iowas eventually had their boats carried on the fan tail. This meant that when the 16-inch guns were fired, they had to be manhandled around on rolling dollies from one side of the ship to the other. Initially, the aviation crane at the stern was being used to move these into the water. However, immediate post-war, the aviation facilities were removed, and the ship started operating helicopters instead of float planes. The helicopters didn't need the crane, and the crane got in the way of the helipad, but it had to be retained for a number of years to operate the boats, and in the 1980s, it was finally deleted, the helipad could be expanded, and a boat boom behind this boat was added. Still not ideal. The Navy never really found a system they were happy with the boats on these ships. Without a doubt, the thing that the Navy hated most about the Iowa Class battleships were their torpedo defense. I'm standing between the holding bulkhead and the armored barbette for turret 1. Because the hull narrows so much forward to get that high speed, there is only enough room for a limited depth of torpedo defense. The U.S. Navy probably had the best torpedo defense system in the world. However, it relies on depth, and with the Iowas, it was just 17.5 feet deep. The older North Carolina class had a much thicker depth, as did the California, Tennessee, and West Virginia when they were rebuilt after Pearl Harbor. Many of the modifications to the Iowa class focused around the torpedo defense. Because these ships have an internal belt, that belt forms one of the 5 layers of defense. Because the belt is so rigid by design to stop shells, it is also rigid when it comes to torpedoes. The torpedo defense system wants to be able to absorb the explosion and bend, not shatter. Because of how rigid the belt was, a torpedo hit on it would cause it to shear, open up a leak that would allow water through. Another issue was the knuckles holding this in place were at an angle in the first 4 Iowa Class battleships. Illinois and Kentucky had this turned into a 90-degree angle, which would have given it as much as 20% more effectiveness against torpedoes. Many of the plans that looked at the Iowa Class battleships included widening them, some by as little as 6 feet, some by closer to 10 or 20 feet, to add more depth to the torpedo defense. This could have been a bolt-on upgrade to existing Iowa Class ships. Again, the older battleships, Tennessee, California, and West Virginia, received this upgrade and got really deep torpedo defenses by adding blisters to the outside of the hull. Those blisters are not entirely watertight, and it would become a preservation nightmare. But more importantly, they would prevent the ships from going through the Panama Canal. New Jersey transited the Panama Canal 10 different times during her life, usually transiting from a home port to a war zone. By adding the entire length of South America around that, we create problems. The ships simply could not transit and redeploy quickly enough, especially since New Jersey was often the only one in commission. Earlier, there were large numbers of battleships in the U.S. Navy, and some were just in the Atlantic, some were in the Pacific, and in a war, you would just transition them all from one to the other. But you make these ships too wide, and then they're stuck on one coast or the other. Effectively, they're limited to the facilities on one coast or the other. The East Coast has considerably more shipbuilding and repair facilities than the West Coast. And it really limits the utility of the ships. And also adding width would decrease from the speed of the ships. So at least one upgrade to the ships looked at cutting off the forward something like 60 feet, maybe just 40 feet, the forward 40 feet of the bow, making it wider, and adding 6 feet of width, 3 feet to the torpedo defense on each side. This would have dropped the speed from 33 knots to 30 knots and restricted the ability to use the Panama Canal. Now, when some of these plans were made, there were also plans in place to increase the width of the Panama Canal. So ships like Midway and Montana, which were being designed, had in mind that the canal could be widened. And these upgrades might have been with the same thought in mind. Another upgrade that was proposed for the Iowas was increasing the subdivision, particularly the engineering spaces. The Iowas had significantly upgraded subdivision over the earlier classes of fast battleships, but less than older standard type battleships, and significantly less than follow-on classes like Montana or Midway. So these plans look at adding additional diesel generators to create more emergency power. Remember, they're adding more and more electronics to these ships. And the Iowas only have 2 as it stands. And it looks at dropping the boilers a level and putting each boiler and engine and turbo generator set in its own compartment so that hits flood a smaller proportion of the ship, and so that a hit is only going to knock out one boiler or one engine or one turbo generator. So what do you think about these plans to change the Iowa Class battleships? What do you like about the Iowas? What would you have changed? Let us know in the comment section down below. If you like the content we're producing, check the description below for ways that you can support the museum and our YouTube channel. Remember to like, share, and subscribe so that you get notifications when we put out new videos. And keep in mind, despite all these things I've said that the Navy didn't like about the Iowas, I do really love the Iowa Class battleships, and these are probably the best battleships ever built.